we're going to look at Andrew Marvell coming towards the conclusion of the course in 17th century poetry. And by and large, as you know, I focused on the metaphysical poets because I think that they're the most interesting and rich group. And it struck me, I've thought about this for years and tried to reconcile not only the type of poetry that emerges in this period, but it's also its appeal in our generation as in the 20th century, which is, I guess, not really our generation, but the metaphysical poets became very popular again thanks to T.S. Eliot and other writers. And why that exactly would be is a interesting question. And I'm not sure I want to answer that here, just because I want to get through the course here and not into my speculations about those sorts of things. But one thing that I certainly was considering here is the use of the microcosm and macrocosm analogy, which I've observed to you and we've seen repeatedly throughout the course. That form of thinking is not a 17th century invention. It's as old as the history of thought. It is there in Greek thinking, so it underlies the Republic, which you've read, and pretty much every work of Greek literature and philosophy. The idea that a human being is a microcosm of everything else. I also think it underlies biblical thought. If you look at the Garden of Eden and the portrait there, biblical commentators of our day will alert you to the fact that the garden, as it is described, and God in the garden, is a lot like the Hebrew temple. And so and God as the priest in walking in the midst of the temple and so forth, and even the dominion mandate and the separating of things for the sake of goodness and holiness, it's almost like a garden temple, which then becomes very important in biblical theology. And I'm trying to think of the name of the contemporary theologian that writes on this to such a degree. What is it called? What's his name again? It's eluding me. It'll come. But he's written on everything from Genesis to Revelation. He's written a commentary on Revelation, in fact, and has observed this fact. And in the book of Hebrews, God describes whoever the author is. Some think it's Paul, some think it's Apollos. It's probably Paul. But the authorship is, let's say, disputed at any rate, unknown. Jesus is described as the great high priest. He's described as the altar. He's described as the sacrifice. And the body of Christ is described as the temple. And his body alone itself is being described as the temple. He says, if you destroy this temple in 3 days, it will rise. And they think he's referring to the temple as in the place where the Jews gather to make their sacrifices to God and to atone for the sins of the people and so forth. But he's referring to his body. So this idea of a microcosm and a macrocosm is strongly implicated in all ancient thought. And it will suggest that there is an intimate correspondence of some sort between what happens to a human being and what happens in the world or in the cosmos. And so the metaphysical poetry of this period, which employs this idea of a microcosm and macrocosm, we've seen it repeatedly. So Donne says, I'm a little world made cunningly of elements and an angelic sprite. Right? That's one of his holy sonnets begins that way. It's not novel for Donne to think this way. This is the way biblical and classical thinkers simply think. They think in terms of these types of analogies. So it's an analogous type of thinking. And using analogs, And that holds all the way until this period, and then it starts to break. And the reason it breaks, I submitted, and I think is still not adequately recognized, is because the view of the cosmos no longer can be held as an analogous one, because things appear out there that are novel and don't apply here, like novas in the sky, or form moons circling Jupiter rather than circling around planet Earth. Everything's supposed to revolve around us. And if you look at Shakespeare's works, the correspondence between the sun in relation to the other planets and the king in relation to his subjects, and so for these sort of analogies all start to break down if the cosmological view no longer is accurate. And so that gives rise to the metaphysical conceit, an unlikely comparison of two things that are seen to be analogous. Right? So the metaphysical conceit and the apparently abstract and unrelated correlation of discordant things, like Dunn's pair of compasses. That becomes the dominant metaphor or use of the day. And a metaphysical conceit, remember, a conceit is simply a type of a metaphor, a concept. A conceit is a concept, it's a metaphysical one. But it's not actually metaphysical, it's an abstract concept. It's not metaphysical. It was metaphysical before because there was a correspondence between physics and metaphysics. And it was a direct correspondence. What we could see in the physical world had a metaphysical architecture underneath it that allowed it to exist as it did. And that was the whole point of astronomy and so forth, because music was correlated with that. And we can hear music. And we can mathematically measure the frequency and so forth. And it's very exact and precise. And the whole cosmos works precisely in accordance with this analogy. But if the analogy no longer holds because of what we see is happening in science, then we move away, we come to sort of abstract type of conceptualizations. And then that gives rise, again, to authors like T.S. Eliot and what he calls the objective correlative and so forth. But again, I said I didn't want to get into that too much, but it was just a reflection, and I wanted to do that as we come to Marvell, because as we conclude with the course, we'll look at Marvell and Vaughan and Traherne, all metaphysical poets, all Protestant. We're going to see that these men tend to write later on, Marvell, Vaughan, and Traherne, and after the, or at least during and after the English Civil War and the Republic and so forth, and things start to become more spiritualized and less politicized. In Milton, for instance, which we're not looking on this course, he very much thinks that the kingdom of God, it can be realized on earth as it is in heaven. And so does Cromwell to some degree. And the Republicans, they think that by being obedient to God and pure in heart, that there can be this fusion of things that have been broken apart through sin. But Marvell, you can see his date 1621 to 1678. So if you think in terms of the other writers, Shakespeare's dying around the time that Marvell is born. And Donne is writing his first works in and around this time. And Marvell's a young man, or Herbert's a young man. Marvell's just born. He has a great body of lyric poetry. And as you can see here, even it says here on this website, he was even a politician in the House of Commons himself at various times during this period, 1659 and 1678. Well, what's that time? That's the time when Charles II returns. And that we need to know a little bit about the man here before we come to his poetry. He's born in Yorkshire, so the north of England. And he was the son of a clergyman who had become a headmaster of a school. He received his early education in Hull, which is most strongly associated with William Wilberforce. But if you look at a map of England, I don't know if I can find a map of England here quickly. So you have some Let's get one with cities on it. That's what I want. And Hull, where is it? It's going to be over here. It's not even big enough to get on the map. Okay, so Yorkshire is here, and then Hull is down here. So we're up in this area of the country at any rate. Yorkshire is up here, right on the east side of the Pennines. The Pennines is the mountain range that goes right down the spine of England and separates it. So the water, the rain that you associate with England, it really falls here on the west coast of England because it hits the Pennines and just drops its rainfall, just like in BC. When you get to the Rockies, what we called, if you didn't remember geography in school, orographic rainfall. The humidity comes, it hits the mountains, and it just drops that. So it's very great for crops, you know, and it's warm, it's temperate. So it rains all the time here on this side of England, and here less so, because for the same reason. It's not that it gets none, but it's not nearly as rainy as it is on this side of the Pennines. So he's living over here in this side of things, and as I say, Hull is around here where the pointer is. So he's educated there, and he goes to Trinity College, Cambridge being here, and Cambridge being the center of their, so they're the two great universities of Cambridge and Oxford. Cambridge is known for its affiliation with Calvinism and with the Reformation. And Oxford is more loyal to the crown and is more Catholic in its theology. Was always so, and still to some degrees. But Cambridge is the place where people with reformed sensibilities are going for their education in England. And Marvell goes there just as Milton went there, and as Herbert went there. So it's significant. So they're deeply steeped in reformed ways of looking at scripture and of life in general. They will have, like everyone in the period will be reading Latin and Greek and Hebrew as part of their education, as well as vernacular languages, but they'll be conversing and writing back and forth with other educated people in Latin. Easy for us to forget that. It's a very different world. That's the lingua franca. If you want to write and correspond with people in Europe, that's what you write in. Took his BA in 1639, traveled on the continent, did the tour. He added French, Italian, Spanish, and Dutch to his knowledge of languages. The so-called Grand Tour. Milton did the same, and it was very common. So you've got your classical languages. Now we'll just pick up, French and Spanish, and just pick those up along the way as you go. Easy enough. Yeah. So how good his French and Spanish, and who knows? While he's away, he did not partake in the English Civil War. Just happens to fall while he's away. And he has some sympathies probably with Charles. However, he's got friends that are on the royalist side. But in 1650 to 1652, important here, he serves as a tutor to the daughter of Lord Fairfax. And Lord Fairfax is the parliamentary general who led the armies of Parliament against Charles I. By this point, he was retired because Lord Fairfax, although he agreed with the parliamentarians' cause against the royalists and against Charles, refused to execute him. He did not want to have anything to do with chopping off his head. He thought it was a terrible mistake and he would not participate in it. And that this becomes consequential for Mr. Milton, for instance, because his friend Marvell is going to intercede on Milton's behalf with Charles II to spare his friend Milton, say, look, he's a blind old man, etc. And because Fairfax didn't agree with killing the king, his tutor also had favor with the son. So that's why Milton survived. Marvell intervened on his friend's behalf, and because he was associated with Fairfax, who refused, even though he opposed the king, to execute the king, he found favor there. So Milton, God's ways are very interesting. Providence is inscrutable in that sense. So he is the tutor of the daughter of Lord Fairfax, the retired parliamentary general, on his estate, non Appleton House. And during the decade of the Commonwealth and Protectorate, he develops an admiration for Cromwell. So he writes an ode to Cromwell. It's called a Horatian Ode. We'll look at that. And in 1653, Milton recommends Marvell to a government post. So recognizes his great learning and thinks that he would be useful in this, but he doesn't take it. But in 1657, he becomes one of Milton's assistants in the Latin secretaryship. So the writing of Latin letters to all the ambassadors and heads of state in Europe. They correspond back and forth in Latin. Oh, your Latin is good enough, you can work in this capacity. It's like being able to write and speak in French in the Canadian bureaucracy. It's a way of promoting yourself, having the fluency in the language. And he becomes a member of Parliament for Hull, as I say, around here in 1659. And he holds on to that until he dies. As I say, reputed to be influential in saving Milton's life afterwards. We'll look at his Upon Appleton House as well as one of the great house poems. I'm not sure I'm going to do that today or next time, but we've looked already at the great house poems, and we'll see this as another of those in the series. We've looked at Amelia Lanier and we looked at Ben Jonson, and so we'll look at his variation on that. But he belongs amongst the second generation of metaphysical poets. So if you study Romantic poetry, there's a first generation and a second generation. Same with the metaphysical poets. There's a first and a second generation. By the time he writes, the style is, I would say, decaying. Doesn't have its original vibrancy. But it is nonetheless extraordinarily interesting, and I think worth our time. After Donne and Herbert, he is probably the great poet of the era, excluding Milton, who stands head and shoulders above the rest. In terms of the metaphysical scope of what he does, I would say that he doesn't have the explicit religious or sexual content of his predecessors. So particularly Donne. I mean, Donne, it's all religion, it's all sex. And if you think about, people talking about, in public conversations, you don't get into religion and politics. In this period, they talk about nothing else but religion and politics. But if you want, we'll just add sex into it as well to make it particularly interesting. Like, it's all the things you're not supposed to talk about, that's all they talk about. So it's very, very interesting in that sense, perennially so. Yes?
I find, even in today's age, that was something that 50 years ago, a lot of, at least dealing with church congregation members, it's we don't talk about the intermingling of politics and faith, and we don't talk about sexual things from the pulpit and stuff like that. And I found that true very much the older generation, where I find
to this day.
Yeah. And then I find the opposite with the younger, where the younger are very much interested in politics, very much interested in how faith applies in that, very much
explicitly, and they want the conversation.
Yeah, and they want the conversation. And I almost think it's when one extreme happens where there's basically a full pull away from something, and there's that void, it then necessarily leads to a counteraction.
Yeah, it's really,
that's all people
I've noticed the same thing, and it is really interesting. So, and you have to understand, you can tell I'm old, so I understand that generation and what they're thinking. The rationale is that we're going to retreat from the connection between religion and politics for the sake of the gospel. So we can talk about Jesus, when we talk about theology, we can talk about personal and relational aspects, we can talk about salvation, but we don't have to bring in politics then. Because if we get into politics, then that is such a firestorm of anger and disagreement that we end up getting distracted by, the fire that's just been set in the corner, and we never talk about the thing that really deserves our attention. So we're just going to not talk about that. It's not that it's important, but we'll just not talk about it. Yeah. But the younger generation now sees that, yeah, but you're talking about something that has no application to our life at all, let alone politics. And the left only ever talks about politics 24/7. And they're making claims that actually do have personal implications, not just personal implications, but even in terms of themes like justice, right? They're talking about justice all the time. And you don't want to talk about that because you don't want to talk about something because you don't want to get caught up in that controversy, and you don't want to be mistaken as another politician. Because you say, well, but this is more important than politics, and you don't have to be with us politically in order to be with us theologically. That was the case 50 years ago, but it's not anymore. So ironically, it's still the boomers that hold the cultural levers and what's going to be talked about in evangelicalism and in Christianity in general, because they have the money and they are politically engaged and so forth. But the younger generation is saying, no, we really want to talk about this, and we are going to talk about that. And if you won't talk about it, then we'll go to people who are talking about it. And those will be, I guess, people like Jordan Peterson, and then more radical individuals more recently, like the Nick Fuentes and the Christian nationalists that aren't even necessarily Christians, and their idea of nationalism is entirely disputable. But now you can see the older generation say, well, that's why we don't want to talk about that. See, this is what happens. Right. Is it leads to very dangerous thoughts. And I see that both sides are right and both sides are wrong, because they had to talk about it all along, and they should have talked about it all along, and they left a void. And guess what? When you leave a void, then all sorts of things are going to fill that void. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say probably the thing I've definitely I won't go into all the details, but I've definitely toned down in some of my opinions over the recent years. Even just being a pastor, I think I've learned to be more gracious and stuff like that. But it's one of the things that when the older generation just dismissed me, it enraged me. And that's what happens with a lot of young people, that they want to talk about it, and it's just no, don't talk about that. It's just so you're basically saying that my thoughts don't matter. That's how we're receiving. My thoughts don't matter.
I don't think that was the intent, but you're right.
No, but that's how it's received. And then it basically, what it does is it radicalizes
the
younger generation.
It does.
And where if we had been able to just meet at this spot of I may not disagree, but I'm going to hear and walk you through things and stuff like that, I don't think we'd be at the point where we're asking the questions we are now.
Yeah.
And so I think you're absolutely
and
right.
more alarming, the older generation, now that they realize they have to talk to it, they are not prepared for the conversation, because they've been avoiding it their whole lives.
Yeah. For
the sake of and what was a method to do a certain thing has become more like a theological stance, which is not really it shouldn't be a theological stance. It was more of a practical avoidance of the issues for the sake of peace in a congregation. Well, we'll have people who vote for the Liberals, people who vote for the Conservatives, people vote for the NDP for good reasons. We can agree to disagree, but we're going to unite around the gospel, right? That might have been the case in the 70s, but now you will find that parties on the radical far left are almost impossible for Christians to support. Mm-hmm. And most people in the churches now will then be pretty unified politically. Yeah. And they still don't want to talk about politics, though. Yeah. So that's an irony there. Yeah, church is always 20 years behind the culture, somebody said. Yeah. I don't know if that's true, but it seems true to me. Anyway, as far as this goes, as I say, he avoids religious content and sexual content. Maybe that's because he's writing during the Republic, and he's seen and probably sympathetic with Fairfax and not cutting off the king's head. But guess what? When the king is dead and there is a republic, well, there's the reality. And do I serve in politics then, even with people that I would have disagreed with on that? And the answer is obviously yes, I will. Even if I didn't agree with their decision there, I'm still going to try and do the best I can. But he's going to avoid political topics. And he's going to avoid explicit sexual content, which we would have seen in the first generation. And I think context is part of that here. So just that to note. But like Johnson, there's an absence of complexity and long or obscure words. He's more classical in that sense. There's a succinctness and a brevity and a clarity about his writing. So more typical of Johnson. So maybe a fusion between the two in that sense. And I would say you could say the same thing about Milton. Milton's not a metaphysical poet. He's very much in the classical tradition, but politically he's very much with the parliamentarians. Politically he is. Religiously he also is. So it's a very rich period in that sense. So many different characters coming from different angles. Where's the difficulty lie in the poems? Well, it's a bit like Herbert. He writes in a very compressed period of time, probably over the course of about 10 years. And as I say, for tutoring Lord Fairfax's daughter, Lord Fairfax, who, as I said, was a soldier and also a member of the House of Lords. And the great man of the parliamentarians. Like Fairfax led the Republican Army. It's only when he retreated that the famous Cromwell comes to the fore. But and Cromwell is a little bit less trustworthy in terms of his public profile because he's not one of the aristocracy. He's from the commoners, as it were. I mean, he's a lesser aristocrat, but doesn't have the standing of Fairfax. And so there's a shift there. And he retreats to Nun Appleton House and retreats there until Cromwell's death. And King Charles returns in 1660. And this is a man that is Fairfax, who is a Renaissance man, really. He's a man capable of very sophisticated thinking, but also a man of action. So he is the sort of model individual. And so the Great House poem on Appleton House is going to be about the house of a Renaissance man. So it's going to be an idealized portrait of the Garden of Eden once again. And if it's the Garden of Eden, it's not just the Garden of Eden of Adam in the Garden of Eden, it's God in the midst of the garden. Remember, God's often portrayed as a gardener in the New Testament. In Jesus' stories, he regularly refers to a gardener, but it's clear that the gardener is God. And the garden is the whole world, but certainly people of Israel. And people break in, there are thieves that break in, and those are political analogies. So again, the microcosm, macrocosm type of thinking is all riddled throughout Scripture. And I rarely hear people pick that up because they're not schooled in literary modes of thinking. They read it historically, or they read it theologically, or they read it as just a sort of a story, but they don't understand the microcosm, macrocosm analogy there. There's a multi-leveled way of reading there, which just, I think, is easy and expected for a biblical audience and a classical audience. But now, after the metaphysical poets, you can barely meet anybody who understands or thinks on those levels, multiple levels. But it must be the case. C.S. Lewis assumes it when in Mere Christianity, when he talks about justice, and then talks about an individual saying that's not fair as a way of introducing natural law. Again, natural law depends on the microcosm, macrocosm analogy there. So, that's what I want to say at the beginning. But he is, Fairfax is the ideal man who can act and contemplate, knows what to do and when to do it. And Marvell writes the great bulk of his work while he lives with Fairfax. and he's a tutor. He has the time and the leisure to write. When he's an MP, he no longer has that time. So it's sort of the opposite of Milton. While Milton's serving in politics, he can't write. Like while he's the parliamentary secretary, and then only when the government falls and he loses his sight, and now he's in retirement, now he writes. Cromwell, or rather Marvell, is writing while Milton is doing politics, and vice versa. So they reverse roles in terms of time period. There's a tension within Marvell between meditations on the garden and what the garden may mean or may not mean. And I'm going to suggest to you that it has Neoplatonic implications, as we'll see when we look at his garden poems. And there are two regular themes I see here. One is his use of the word nature, which is going to baffle you, I think, or it might confuse you, because after the Romantics, we always see nature in an idealized form. And Marvell, and we'll see Vaughan and Traherne, all seem to do this with nature as well. They give nature a sort of it's a purifying force, it's an idealized force, it's a state of original nature, and that it's quasi-romantic, proto-romantic, like 150 years before the Romantics. In Marvell, Vaughan, and Traherne, we get a sense of nature in which nature is idealized and even almost seen as a goddess. Not quite the way the pagans saw nature, but still. It's something we experience, but not that we analyze. We don't take Bacon's posture towards it. It's not something that we try to dominate and gain power from. That Bacon just wants to take nature and treat it like a slave and mold it and break it and do whatever he wants, so it gives us more out of it. Like it's a thing. In Marvell, nature is more like it is for Wordsworth, it is something that we enjoy, participate in, and take delight in. We experience it, we don't analyze it. And by implication, the second theme is that there's an antithesis between action and contemplation. When we act, we actually don't allow nature to do what nature does. The purpose of nature is to be contemplated, not acted upon. And in that sense, again, it's very much proto-romantic. So nature is the realm of contemplation, not of action. In my notes here, my notes from when I was an undergrad, E.J. Devereux noted that Marvell was the first European poet of nature in this sense. Before Wordsworth. I'm struggling now to recall what C.S. Lewis, when he wrote on nature, whether he talked about the metaphysical poets and of Marvell. I don't think he did, but I should go back and look at that. He certainly knew about the period, but I can't remember particularly this. But nature is something to be contemplated and delighted in and participate in it. And that's because he has a certain view of truth, which I think has also been lost. That in philosophical discourse, there are, in general, two theories of truth. There's the correspondence theory of truth. You know, we have a word, and it corresponds to a concept behind that, the res signa thing. And then we have a coherence theory of truth. It's true because things sort of cohere together. In general, I prefer the correspondence theory of truth, but there's another type of truth which I think Marvell is closer to, and that's a participative theory of truth. That when we regard the truth and affirm the truth, we're in some sense participating in it. It's part of a Christian conception of truth. It's better than correspondence theory of truth. When we affirm that Jesus is Lord and that he's the truth, we're united with him. There's a participation in his presence. That's not just saying the right things, logically speaking. It's participating in the truth by affirming the truth. There's something of being united with Christ and affirming theologically that he is so. And that's why in Scripture it says that anyone who says that Jesus is Lord is a believer, because they're already united with him in making that affirmation. It's not just saying the words. There's more at stake there than that. Yes.
I was going to say, I think that's really important, even just in terms of general practice of like things like going to church and whatnot, that you're
participating.
Yeah, you're not just confessing Christ as Lord via your mouth.
Like a verbal affirmation.
Yeah, you are showing with action, with the other saints, that we are united in Christ and we have peace with God and peace with one another.
Yeah, well, and again, the Greeks will say the importance of actions, and the Romans will, and so will the Hebrews, and all the Christians will. It's not enough to say these things. Show me the man who does these things, and then I'll show you the man who believes. I'll show you by what I do.
Yeah.
And it's not replacing, it's not either or, it's both. One is the expression of the other. The action shows that what you're saying is actually a participation. That's the point. You're showing that it's participation by acting. And it's not just the verbal correspondence theory that I say this, but I don't really believe it. I've given you all the right answers. I passed the test. I get 100 on my theology test, and yes, but are you a believer? No. Well, then you're like Satan and the devils who have the right theology, but they don't believe a word of it. They don't act in accordance with it. That's what's being said. So they don't have a participative theory of truth, right? So, yes.
Yeah, it's the critique towards the Pharisees that Christ constantly gives.
Yes.
That you praise me with your lips, but your hearts are far from
right.
me. And even telling his disciples, do as they say, but not as they do. Like, there's this emphasis that they constantly say these praises towards God, but their actions do not follow that praise.
Absolutely. So again, I think Marvell's emphasis here on participating in nature through contemplation is not a lack of action, it's a participation in a metaphysical sense, but now it's not in the metaphysical sense of done of an abstraction, it's more of a unification and it has a theological implication, although the theology is not strongly foregrounded. It's in the background. And it often seems to be Neoplatonic even. I'll talk more about that in a bit. But let me stop here and I'll get